All right, we can get started. So I'm gonna share my screen and we're gonna hop in. So before we go into the topic itself, let me give you a quick intro on Pearmill, what we do, who we are. I'm Nima Gardide. I'm one of the founders of Pearmill. We help companies with paid search and paid social, all the way from media buying, growth marketing, to ad creative production and conversion rate optimization, attribution modeling. And we also have a couple of internal tools for alerting and anomaly detection, and ad spend deployment, and so on. So we're sort of slightly tech enabled. And we recently are we're looking for beta testers for one of our internal tools if you're doing paid social advertising. My background is engineer by trade. I've been doing marketing stuff for the past 5-6 years now, and we spend close to $100 million a year. So we should hopefully be, I have some level of sort of understanding of these networks and what gets them to perform well. Something like 30% of our ad spend is in healthcare. And so what I'm presenting to you today is just the learnings, cumulative learnings over the last 8 months or so that I've gotten from speaking to both VPs in marketing and CMOs of these healthcare companies, as well as some of their general counsels, as the sort of guidance from the HHS has changed. So today, what I'll talk about more succinctly is, kind of like reminding everyone why now. Why are we talking about this topic? Why has it become important all of a sudden again? And what we need to sort of take from this change. I'm going to present what I'm calling a best-in-class tracking stack. And so these is slightly technical, but I will keep it high level, just so you understand sort of what if you weren't in HIPAA, what is the best stack, and then we're going to together edit that stack and get to a point where it's HIPAA compliant. And I thought of this path as a sort of easy way to get your mind wrapped around how you have to sort of exert control on data flowing out of your systems in order to make sure that you're HIPAA compliant, as well as sort of getting the most out of performance from these ad networks. So we're going to go through that together. And the last part is just going to be Q&A. As I mentioned a couple of times earlier in the Q&A section, you can use the Q&A feature of Zoom. I'm going to get to as many questions as I can at the end. And if I don't know the answer and one of you do, you can raise your hand and we can have that conversation. All right, so why now? Before we get into that, another disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. I just help run Pearmill, and we have clients in healthcare, and I've spent some time trying to get an understanding of the laws in order to sort of make changes to the tracking infrastructure that we manage for the clients. And I have basically around 5 different companies, all of which are at a decent scale that fall under HIPAA, who have taken some of these actions. And so you've probably seen some of these headlines, and I apologize if this is triggering for you, but it's just the reality of what's happening in the market. We have the OCR coming down on a lot of healthcare companies who've not been following HIPAA's rules. So there are old HIPAA rules that have been around for a while. There's a new guidance that came about, I believe, in August of last year. And this new guidance is much harder to comply with, and so it's created this sort of clear hole for OCR to go in and punish the companies that are not following it. And so what I'm going to present first is sort of a path for tracking and the best practices for tracking first, and then we're going to edit it together. So if the sort of changes that they made in the guidelines, and they're going to affect directly the different parts of the tracking stack that I'm going to go through. They've been made by the HHS, which is the sort of US Department of Health and Human Services, and then the OCR, which is the Office for Civil Rights, is the enforcer of these things. And the biggest takeaways that we're going to talk about a couple of times is one is that this is the gray area part. That IP address can be considered IIHI, which is individually identifiable health information. A quick primer in case you're not a technical marketer, IP addresses are effectively prevalent the moment you make any form of a request from one entity to another. So your browser making a request to a Facebook pixel, your server making a request to another server, they inherently have IP address in there. They're using what's a protocol called TCP/IP, and you literally have to put your IP address in there. It's just part of the protocol and the way it works. So this is basically fundamental internet protocol things, and they're saying this can be considered IIHI. And the second part, and this is a major difference than the past sort of guidance, is that any authenticated page, so if the user is authenticated on any of your pages, so this could be sort of post sign up, including the login page, they have some notes on the login page. These fall under HIPAA, so all the information will be under HIPAA, and so we're going to have to talk about the difference between these user authenticated web pages and screens, and what that means for your tracking infra and how you can sort of understand them and change them. All right, so let's talk about the best in class tracking stack. So the way I've designed this one is basically the top line here is, think of it as the user journey, right? So there may be viewing a page on one of your landing pages, then they go through a sign up process. They're now in the sort of post user authenticate page area. They're scheduling an appointment with a doctor, let's say, and or making a purchase. These are the things the user can go through. And at any given point, you want to be thinking about each action that's happening in your platform as at a user level, it's happening in one place, but you can have evidence of it happening both on the front end and the back end. So what we recommend is to track in from both areas. So if someone's landing on the page, you want to track it from the front end and the back end. Someone performing an action like a sign up, you want to track it from the front end and the back end, and so on and so forth. And again, this is not in the HIPAA world. Let's just stick to the, if we didn't have any restrictions, what we do, this is the best case scenario, is we have tracking implemented from both front end and back end for all the major, what we call critical events internally at Pearmill, critical events being events that you're judging your business with. And they all should be flowing to a customer data platform of sorts. So there are quite a few players in the space. There's Segment, RudderStack, FreshPaint are the sort of more popular players these days. Google Tag Manager is sort of a CDP, doesn't hold any data, but it can be a layer sometimes people use. I don't recommend that. Usually I want Segment or RudderStack or FreshPaint underneath Google Tag Manager, but the idea is that you have one central place that your data flows to first, before then they flow to your analytics tools, like your Google Analytics, your ad networks, Meta Ads or Google Ads or Amplitude, and a different sort of analytics apparatus or marketing tooling that you might be using. And so your customer data platform is in charge of sort of holding the data and then pushing it out to these things. So that's kind of the best in class tracking stack. So we're going to first go through some legal aspects of how to sort of prepare yourself to then attempt to do almost all of this with some modifications. And then I'm going to talk about the edits that we're going to have to make in a more nuanced way. So the first thing to understand about this best practice is that you want basically your CDP as your main source of event streams. The importance of this is actually like, it's not as obvious in the early stages of a company. And so if there's a bunch of startup founders and CMOs in place and you're like, hey, I don't want to pay for that, it's expensive. I can tell you, you will thank me in a couple of years from now how important this is. Your whole data warehouse apparatus can be built on top of this thing. And you can build your own attribution models. You can build business reporting on this stuff. So it's very important for that to be the sort of main layer. And most of these tools now have alerting capabilities. So you can build alerting on top of it to make sure that, hey, if something is no longer being tracked, someone gets notified and so on. So that's one major sort of positive point. Other than that, you know, there is the ability to sort of separate front-end and back-end events is important for data folks. And you want to be feeding the equivalent to these funnel events from both back-end and the front-end to these ad networks. And the reason for why that's important, you're all marketers in the room, so I assume you understand it generally, but it's important for the ad networks to get the maximum amounts of signal when it comes to conversions. And the front-end signals tend to be better for attribution for them because they have some form of a cookie on there, and that detail is very helpful. Backend sort of covers the gaps for people that are using ad blockers. So the best practice right now is to send the same event from both front end and back end, and the ad networks are deduplicating these things. And then the reason back end events for analytics tools is important is because you don't have any sort of ad blocker restriction. But the problem with just sending back end only events is that you don't have sort of marketing attribution. So you do need the page view data, and you need to sort of connect the dots there. So having tracking from both front end and back end, and then connecting the dots through some, Google Analytics 4 uses what's called a client ID, and you pass that on the back end. Some of these tools like Amplitude are smart enough to do user ID matching. So these are sort of the reasons why this tracking stack is important. We can go through why in the Q&A section if you're curious about why I'm recommending the stack in general, but we have quite a few clients, and literally every single one of them is on this stack. And the reason for that is not really nuanced anymore. It's pretty clear nowadays that this is sort of what you should be building. It does require some technical knowledge, and you have to sort of sell it to the product org and the marketing org. But let's talk about the big sort of elephant in the room, which is none of these networks, they're basically consuming data from your website and your backend, and some or all of that data could be under HIPAA. So what are we going to do there? Fortunately, in the HIPAA guidance, there's always been this business associate agreement. It's a type of agreement you can sign with another company where that company can ensure that they're responsible for handling PHI and PII. And at the moment, so this was, if you'd asked me 6 months ago, I would have said this is just horrible. Not a lot of these companies are willing to sign BAAs with you and so on. But fortunately, as of the last month or so, a lot of these companies have just woken up to this reality, and a lot of their sort of customers were flocking away or disabling accounts and so on. So they're willing to now sign BAAs. I have confirmation from all these ones I've listed here that they will sign a BAA: Segment, RudderStack, FreshPaint, Amplitude, Snowflake, BigQuery. These are sort of fundamental data engineering and data stack companies that are willing to sort of sign BAAs with you. Amplitude was a surprising one because they're an analytics tooling. In juxtaposition of that, Google Analytics 4 is not willing to sign a BAA with you, as far as I know. Neither are any of the ad networks, of course, because why would they care? And so this gives us the ability to, if we go back to this, the best in class, not so pretty diagram that I have created here, that this CDP layer, all of these folks are willing to sign BAAs with you. And where the data lives, which is Snowflake and or BigQuery, they're also willing to sign BAAs with you. And so that means at least in the first layer, we're okay. So we can do almost everything up until the customer data platform in this layer. And as long as you go and hustle and get BAA signed, which by the way will cost you money, so that is a blocker. So these companies are not dumb. They're like, hey, you all of a sudden have to care about this. You may be already into Segment and using it, and so we're going to charge you extra money because we have all this process and all this sort of care we have to have around the data that you're now sending to us and we're consuming. So we're going to charge you more money. It's not, I don't have exact numbers, but I have heard that every single client of ours that has had to sign a BAA has been charged more for it, which makes sense because there's sort of like, there are extra processes and changes they've had to make to their infrastructure to support this. So my first piece of advice is start running around getting these things signed. Now, I'm going to walk through 3 major edits that we have to do in order to be compliant from that second layer. So now we want to be compliant, sending data to Google Analytics, to Meta, to to the Google Ads, to Amplitude. Although Amplitude will sign a BAA, so you don't have to do much there. But for all the ones that won't sign a BAA, we now have to be HIPAA compliant. So how are we going to do that? We're going to have to make 3 edits to how we are sending data to these things. So the number 1 edit is to start thinking about PII and some of the auto consumption functionality that these ad networks and Google Analytics tools have, right? So for instance, Meta ads, if you have enabled advanced matching, they will automatically start looking for any email address that you type on the page, and they try to grab as much metadata as possible. They don't send the raw things, raw data. So there is sort of like, it's questionable that they would be really under HIPAA when they're doing this, but they may even raise a flag for your account that you have this on. So you want to be disabling any sort of advanced matching apparatus that any of these networks have. The good news is that all the backend conversion APIs, you can sort of control exactly what's sent there, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But they do use these emails and phone numbers and the sort of PII that you may have as ways to do front end and back end matching, which increases your what's called the sort of match rate score. And both Google have this and Meta have this as well. And we're going to talk about how you can sort of go around this and solve for it without PII. So you do want to stop sending this stuff. And then so the major changes you're going to use is basically disable advanced matching. And then instead of using the user ID, or sorry, the user email or the phone number, you can then use anonymous IDs you can generate as your external IDs. And both Google and Meta supports basically matching on some ID. And so that's what you want to do. This is, I'm not going to go too technical on this, but this is possible, and I have proof that we can get pretty high scores, but just not sending any of this PII as a tool to do front-end and back-end matching. And the other stuff is just the micro data control. So, back to Meta specifically, if you, for instance, open up the Pixel Helper, Meta Pixel Helper on a site, and you click around, you'll see that they're sending all this sort of metadata automatically for every click. And the reason they do this is because they have that sort of event setup tool that helps you track based on clicks and based on page views and so on. In healthcare, you essentially need to just decide that you're not going to be able to use that and move away from that. So you can disable it. It's in the settings. Just disable any of these automatic tracking things. If you're using something like Heap, they have a lot of automatic tracking stuff. You just want to get away from that as much as possible, because they're just going to auto-consume things that you don't know if they fall under HIPAA or not. And so you're going to have to care about that. And the last thing here on the automatic tracking side is if you're using Google Ads, you may have automatic keyword attachment to your queries. So, if you understand Google Ads, you might have template tracking URLs that include the keywords that the user is sort of clicking on before arriving on your site. That keyword all of a sudden makes the page that they visit fall under the EPHI definition. And the reason is basically the keyword might say things like pregnancy or some word that makes it clear that they may have a specific disease. And so what I ask you to do is just to disable that. It's not worth the optimization you get from per keyword understanding at the UTM level. And so that's one of the first things we had done early days last year, where we just disabled that. Commonly people use something like UTM term to pass in the keywords. I also recommend disabling that. All right, next up is events. So, IP address. Yeah, IP address. Let's address IP address and we'll get to events. So obviously I talked about IP address. Right now, this seems to be under the gray area, because IP address by itself, if you know enough about IP addresses, do not necessarily relate to a specific person. And so at the moment, there's at least one case where OCR has explicitly sued someone, and someone being a company, for usage of IP address being sent to different ad networks. But it was in conjunction with other PHI and PII, and they lost that case. That's the BetterHelp case. And so it's unclear that they are willing to go after folks directly for IP address only. And to give you an idea, about half of our clients have decided to not send IP address at all, which it is an extreme take on this, and I can tell you what that takes, what it takes to do that. And then the other half have decided to continue sending it. So it's going back to the disclaimer, not legal advice. I'm just going to tell you how to disable IP address and what the move is there. So the problem basically with IP address is that because it's at the protocol level, every single call being made from any of your users' Chrome browser or Safari browsers or the browsers that are using to sort of browse the internet include their personal IP address. So when you include the Facebook pixel on your page, the moment the page view event is sent to Facebook, technically Facebook now knows about the IP address of the person. My understanding is that Facebook is, I think when you disable advanced matching, they don't consume IP address. With that said, I'm not sure if that's going to hold in the rule of law in court. And so when any of our clients decide to not send IP address, what they've basically done, and this might sound scary to you, is they've completely disabled front-end pixels. So there are problems with that, of course, I'm going to address these, but that is the only path. If you want to fully shut off IP address, you cannot use pixels on the front end, and you are left with backend only conversion reporting to the ad networks. You can make these backend reporting functions do a decent job. It's not going to be the same. You're not anywhere close to the same sort of rate, because the way they do it, as you know, is that they have some signal on the front end that this person at least visited the sites that you have, and then they do the sort of matching on their end after you send the backend conversion. Even if you had no front end conversion, they at least expect some page view. What we're saying now is there is no page view. And so you're now stuck with effectively sending either PII, which we discussed, you don't want to be sending, although they're going to be hashed. And so one of our clients at least is okay with sending hashed email addresses, although the rest of them are not. So you're stuck with really one thing, which is the cookies and the click IDs. So when you click on any of these ads on Bing, on Google, and Facebook, they attach a click ID as a query parameter to your page. And so you're going to have to store that, and then there's ways you have to generate a specific version of it, and then send it via the backend APIs to report conversions. Google has this, Facebook has this, Bing has this. Almost no one else has. And so now you are limited in terms of what ad networks you can actually do this with, but such is the reality. And one thing that is good with the backend events is that even though there will be an IP address involved, it will not be your customer's IP address, because your server is making some call to Facebook servers, let's say, or Meta servers, and the IP address involved there in that protocol is your servers. So Facebook, first of all, is not consuming that IP address, and secondly, they're not going to use it to match because they know it's your servers, and so it's not your customer. So you are protecting the customer with this model, where you're not sending the IP address from the front end and only sending metadata that you choose to send to Meta on the back end. In order for them to consume let's say in a non-HIPAA compliant scenario, they ask you to explicitly put in what they call the client IP address, which is the sort of your user's IP address from the back end, in order to do this type of matching. So the path away from IP address is effectively to fully use the backend APIs and then explicitly choose what metadata you pass and not include IP address. And the downside here, there's a big performance downside here in that your match rates are going to be horrible, and unless you're already at scale, you're just going to have a tough time getting there. And so let me address the events here and why events matter in general before I tell you how to edit them to be compliant. So if you don't know already, Facebook, Google, TikTok, and a couple more ad networks, it looks like Twitter has joined their ranks here, are effectively doing machine learning based targeting. What that really means is that they're consuming all the information you give them and all the information the users that click on your ads are giving them in order to target people in their network. And so that means the signals that you give them are extremely important. So forget about just the copy that you write and the creative that you write, which, by the way, we have proof that are being pulled into the ML models and change the targeting. You're also sending this very valuable other signal, which is the event that goes into their system. So telling them, hey, someone made a purchase or someone scheduled an appointment or any sort of indication of a high quality user is going to help you get better costs. And on average, they need around 20 of these conversions per week per ad set or ad group for them to have any sort of chance to optimize using the ML models. Now, so if you move to this backend only apparatus that I talked about, and you're an early stage company, you're just not going to get enough signal in to take advantage of their machine learning. And so one of the paths you may want to take, and I know this sounds scary, is just to increase your ad spend in order to get there. But regardless, you're going to have to continue using some events to optimize. And so this section, I'm going to talk about what our clients have done in order to sort of make sure that they're still HIPAA compliant. And so the main philosophy basically here is to avoid sending any detailed named events where someone from Facebook could look into your events manager and someone from Google can look into your Google Ads conversions area and figure out what those things mean. And so what they've all done is to use some obfuscated name. A lot of our clients are using color names, probably because I like colors and I've been suggesting color names. And I'm not going to present to you what color names they've chosen for what specific event, but the idea is to come up with some mapping internally, and you lock that mapping. Only the marketers are in purview to it, and you do not tell your reps on the Facebook side or Google side what these names are, and you basically send custom conversions and forego using what's called the standard events of these ad networks. Because theoretically, if you then send these standard events, you're now still giving them that signal. The standard event going into purchase is a signal to Facebook or to Meta or to Google that this user made a purchase, and that could be considered PHI. And so, or sorry, PHI, I think I'm saying that correctly. And so everyone's moved off them. It's not as easy as I say it. As you know, you're going to have to basically double send events for a while, send the purchase event and the colored event, and then slowly move your ad sets and campaigns off to the new events and test and make sure that you can maintain the performance and so on. Usually it takes 2 to 3 months to do this right. And so I suggest doing this one immediately if you haven't already moved away from named events. Fortunately, on Google Ads, it's very simple. You just go and rename the stuff in the Google Ads dashboard. Meta, TikTok have this issue because they're not ID based. LinkedIn does not have this issue. Twitter does not have this issue. So this is more of a Meta, TikTok, and I think Snap problem than the rest. But it's a clever way to get around this. That's sort of on the event side. Now, the second part is the metadata. So we talked about the user authenticated pages might be PHI, and the front-end pixels tracking too much. So for those areas, you want to effectively forego front-end tracking. So we talked about IP address way, where we fully disable all IP address by disabling the pixels. You could do that, or a sort of middle ground is to have the page view events available up until the user authenticates. And the idea here is that we're going to basically get a lot of match rate gains by being able to do this. Why? Because then we can store the user's user agent and pass that along to do the matching. And Facebook and Google and all these folks are going to be able to at least use their pixels to then fingerprint the user to some extent. So then when you're sending some obfuscated named event as the backend event, you can get basically the same sort of performance as you would have, or very close performance as you would have if you had a front-end pixel firing the same event, because you have these earlier page views that are not authenticated, theoretically do not fall under HIPAA unless this IP address only thing becomes an issue. And so that's a decent middle ground area for you to sort of potentially consider. We have a couple of clients on this model. And so I'm a fan of it, and I think you should really seriously consider it. And so really what we're talking about here is the strict version of the stack is backend only, right? So we have backend only events being sent for everything. We're missing a bunch of details here. The IP address is not going there. These folks are not being able to fingerprint people as well as they would have otherwise, but at least we're sending the data in, and there's some match rates. And we have our CDP still collecting everything, which is great, and we can do our own analysis on top of it. And the trade-offs here are that basically there's you're not under any legal gray area that I know of again, and so you're pretty straightforward there. You still have great internal attribution, because even though these are backend, you can sort of do your own anonymous ID work on the front end and pass that along, and so you can still have a decent sort of attribution system. And you're still sending some conversion data, to the ad networks for optimization, but not everything. And you're going to have tough external attribution on ad networks, as well as analytics tools, because they need these front-end events. And it's a harder technical implementation. So you have to store the click IDs that we talked about from the ad networks. You probably have to create your own anonymous ID. You have to pass on the page views from the backend, which some folks don't automatically implement, and so on. And you're going to be limited to some networks. So not all the analytics tools in the ad networks out there support backend only conversions. Or if they support it, you cannot use them for optimization. For instance, Google Ads has two backend tools. One is called the Google Enhanced Conversions, which requires a front-end event version of that conversion. And then they have the Google Offline Conversions. In our experience, Google Offline Conversions you can't theoretically pick it to use it for optimization, but it's just not been as performant as the Google Enhanced Conversion model, which requires at least a front-end pixel. The second version of this is basically doing the front-end events, as I talked about, before the authenticated pages, and then switching to the back-end version of the events for the post-authenticated pages. And so the positive parts of this is that you're sending these more clear conversion signals to the ad networks. You're going to have better match rates. You don't need to do a lot of technical implementation. It's much easier and sort of tighter to do this, to get the sort of signals in right. Obviously, the big con here, and there's only one of them I've listed out here, is that you're potentially in a legal gray area. At least a couple of general counsels I've spoken to do not believe that this is the right model. And so, this is a non-strict, sorry, I need to change the title of this slide. But this is sort of a model that you could approach. Cool, so that's kind of the overall recommendation. There's a couple of questions I'm going to answer, but just to close it off, this might all sound scary to you. There's a lot of work to be done, and I've said this to all the VPs that we work with. The good news is that you are in the same boat as everybody else, and if you think in auctions, and this is sort of what we do at Pearmill, we generally think in the auctions that you're going to end up in. Right, so you're going to end up in some auction with another potential competitor or startup that's trying to get attention from the same people, and they're all purview to the same laws. So that means they're also sort of competing in this auction with the same handicaps as you. So even though this might be scary and you're like, oh, I can't use the ML models in the way that I could if I were in a non-HIPAA compliant sort of apparatus, you are in the same auctions as everyone else. And what you want to do is just survive long enough that if there are bad actors in the auctions, they get caught. And this just seems to be the general consensus amongst all of our clients, is that they don't want to be the bad actors. They believe there will be bad actors that probably make their customer acquisition costs balloon for a short period of time until OCR does more sort of cracking down on these bad actors. And the sooner you make this sort of choice, the safer you are, legally speaking. And so I'm going to go through the questions, but as I mentioned, if you feel like you know the answer and I don't, I'm happy to bring you up here. And other than that, I'll add one last thing, which is if more things sort of come up on this general topic, especially from the community here, I'm going to email all of you after this and ask you if you would recommend other things, or you would change any of the recommendations. I'd like to compile these and send it out to everyone if there's new learnings that should be shared. So please be looking for that email that's coming from me in the next couple of days. All right. Question number one is, how do these HIPAA compliant CDPs pass data back to the app platforms and analytics tools like Google Analytics in a compliant way? Do they aggregate or obfuscate the signals? Okay, so the answer to this is actually completely up to you. So fortunately, all of these networks, all these sort of systems, Segment, RudderStack, FreshPaint, have decent configuration options where you can tell them not to send stuff, especially on the back end. On the front end, it's a bit of a problem. They don't have as sort of tightly controlled systems on both on these CDPs as well as just generally because of that IP address problem. But on the back end, you can explicitly say, explicitly sort of pass along the metadata that you want to be passing along. And so it's really up to you. And what you want to do is make that decision of what I want to be passing to them, and explicitly make sure that you have some process where not everyone's allowed to touch those config files, and they're not files, you know, config pages, and make sure that if they are changing them, there is some form of a review, which is sort of what we've implemented in our company. Our next question was, so limit any dynamic altering of ads and landing pages. That's a really good question. At the moment, we think yes, waiting to hear back more. We are altering them in the sense that not using something in the query parameter, but rather generating unique pages and still putting them behind, at least at the ad group level on Google. As you know, you just get better quality scores if you do that. But the comment I made was to make sure that you don't pass the UTM keyword or UTM term with the keyword, because these systems auto track things. So if you have the Google or Facebook pixel on your site, they auto track the page URL, which includes the keyword, which then has some potential PHI, and you're going to be in trouble. So the idea basically is to make sure that you don't have any content in the URL, and it's what they collect in there. They don't collect, to my knowledge, unless you have enabled that sort of event setup auto tracking thing. They do not collect any content from your page. So you're okay to sort of have some level of dynamic data in there. Next question was, is there a way you recommend editing conversion event names while minimizing performance impacts? That's a very good question. I'll tell you that, you know, it takes a few months to get this right. You will have slightly elevated CAC when you do it, but the main sort of methodology we use, and you know, the main problem is usually in this scenario is meta ads. The main sort of approach we've used is basically to have a separate campaign with the basically fully replicated ad sets, campaign ads of your evergreen campaigns, getting 20% of the budget and then scaling up slowly over time. That's sort of one path I've seen. The other path one of our clients is trying out is basically within your evergreen campaign, and that does matter if you're doing CBO or ABO, but in their scenario, they're doing ABO. They are splitting the ads, they're basically copying the ad sets in the same campaign with a new conversion event as the optimization event, and then similarly sort of putting a portion of the budget towards it and then slowly scaling it up. You want to be essentially approaching this just like any other experiment or other change you'll be making. You want to basically isolate it as much as possible and be prudent with the budget that goes behind it, and then slowly scale it up, with the caveat that you should always wait. You need to have at least enough budget behind it to get to that 20 number, 20 conversions per week per ad set number. And so you should be making the decision based off of that sort of hard limit, plus the sort of general limit of do not mess with the budget or do system too much because things will break. Next one related to this is using obfuscated event names in Facebook would mean having to use a custom event instead of standard event. Does this mean that we'd expect to see a performance hit even after initial ramp periods, since standard events are typically more performant? Great question. The answer really depends on you, actually. So in Meta, you can use standard event machine learning models, even if it's a custom conversion event. The way you do that is when you're creating the custom conversion off of an existing event. So yeah, I'm sure you've done this before. You can pick what this event means. And when you pick, let's say, purchase, it then ends up using the same machine learning apparatus under the hood. So even though it's a custom conversion, it uses the standard events machine learning model. With that said, you have to make one decision. First, are you giving Meta the signal that that event is a purchase event by choosing that option? At least one of our clients thinks, yes, we are. And so they're not using that. So in that scenario, you're for sure going to see some performance hit, at least at first. And it all comes down to the issue I mentioned earlier. It all matters what your scale is, right? So the standard events are more performant because they have all this past learnings from all these different brands about what it takes to get someone to purchase. But over time, your pixel plus account, ad account plus, let's say, campaign plus ad set learn beyond what that sort of standard model is holding, and they get better than the sort of average ability that model has. So if you're at scale, you're going to be fine. Short term, you're going to see a hit, but then when you get to, let's say, hundreds of conversions per week per ad set, these things don't matter as much. All right, so there's another question on iOS 17. Will strip click IDs from URLs? Yes, they will on Safari and on general web views. As I understand it, it's going to be a big problem for web tracking. It's going to drop a bunch of this stuff. At the moment, I understand that there will be no stripping if it's off of messages. So they strip it from email and messages, not when I'm clicking from a Facebook web view. But I don't know enough about that to tell you what's going to happen yet. Next question is, how do you feel about uploading hashed emails for negative customer audience lists? I don't have a good answer for this. One of our clients is not even comfortable building custom audiences off of conversions that are coming in, because basically you're telling Facebook that these are customers. I would say, at least based on the HIPAA texts that I've read quite a few times, they really don't cover these cases. They don't really cover hashed things at all. And so at least 2 of our clients out of the 5 are sending the hashed version of the email to do conversions API matching, because they feel that they're not sending PII in an explicit way, and Facebook's just doing their own matching on their end. But I want to go back to the disclaimer. I don't know if that's legal advice. I don't know if that's fair, and it's hard to say if this is going to be prosecuted. All right. Yeah, I think I also addressed the next question, which is using remarketing pixels to create lists. Similarly, it's unclear to me, especially if they were on authenticated pages. If they were on unauthenticated pages, I think you're probably fine. If they're on authenticated pages, I think it's a gray area that we just have. It's hard to tell what's going to happen. And someone in the group mentioned that iOS will not strip as much as you think in terms of the click IDs, which is good news. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. As I mentioned, there's going to be an email coming in from me soon in the next couple of days around, giving your notes and information about what you are choosing to do as a company, to help us really help the community make decisions around how to change their tracking apparatus in order to make sure that you're compliant, and as well as sort of de-risking the performance hit that you might be hitting. And as always, if you need help with any of this stuff, media buying, creative production, CRO, we're here. Email me at nima@pearmill.com or allison@pearmill.com. Really appreciate you all showing up, and hope you have a nice day.